Welcome to this full council meeting to consider the representation review submissions. I'll just open with karakia, kia tau mai te manamatanga, kia tau mai te rangimarie, kia tau mai te kaha mō te aroha mō tēnei kaupapa hui e tai kia. We have one apology from Councillor Mailing. Someone moved, and from Councillor Shellcrest, moved Councillor McKenzie, seconded Councillor Hill. All those in favour, please say aye. There is no public forum. Declarations of interest, none. Late items, none. There are minutes to be confirmed. So firstly, the minutes of the 12th of September. Someone prepared to move the confirmation of those minutes. Move Councillor McKenzie, seconded Councillor Dakey. All those in favour, please say aye. The confidential minutes of the same meeting. Move Councillor Dakey, seconded Councillor Kinnemont. All in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. And that now brings us to the hearing of submissions. So each submitter has 10 minutes to speak to their submission. And obviously also if they wish to leave time for questions within that 10 minutes, that's all good, but not required. And I'll take them in the order which I have them in the agenda. So there's Graham Halua, Mathias, Schaeffner and Tasman Democracy and Bruce Struthers. So each submitter has 10 minutes to speak. So we will take those submitters now. So first up is Graham. Or not, in the case of not being present. If he does turn up post or during the course of the submission hearing part of the submissions, i.e. in the next 20 minutes to half an hour, we'll take him in any event. So that brings us to the next submitter, which is Mathias Schaeffner and Tasman Democracy. Welcome, Mathias. So I will give you a little ding, somewhere around 10 minutes if you happen to still be speaking. Oh, it's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll just take another 2 seconds up there.
All good. Mathias, over to you.
Okay, cool. Right. We'll start over here. Okay. Okay. Good morning. I'm speaking on behalf of Tasman Democracy. We are a membership-based non-profit organization that advocates for the interest of the community and encourages debate, dialogue, and democratic decision-making. So the question is, what is the purpose of a representation review? The law says that electors receive a fair representation. So the question is, what is a fair representation? The law says that people are not over and not under represented by 10%. So the question is, with your proposal, how many people would get a fair representation? Only 29%. That means more than 40,000 people would not get fair representation. That's almost 3/4 of all people living in the Tasman district. They would not get a fair representation after the next election. Elections are the cornerstone of every democracy. The 10% rule was enacted by Parliament, who expresses the will of the people. And you go out with a proposal that tells the vast majority, no, you don't get a fair representation. And even worse, you're not open and you're not transparent. Instead, you ask, yeah, what do you support, what you don't support? But instead, if you were open and transparent, you would ask, do you support that only 29% of people get a fair representation and more than 40,000 not? We all know what the result of such a question would be, because people aren't stupid. If you treat them with respect, provide information, and be open and transparent. There are 92 submissions on this representation review. For full transparency, none of the other submitters is a member of our organization, and none of them is a family member, a friend, and I haven't met any of the other submitters. We can see from all of the submission that the majority talk about Maori wards, but this topic will be handled in a separate process. A lot of people talk about community boards and support them. So I think also this topic needs no discussion. The third topic that a lot of people comment on is whether or not Golden Bay should have 1 or 2 councillors, and that's up for debate. But if we leave out these 3 topics, Maori ward, community boards, and number of Golden Bay councillors, we can focus on the main question, which is, do people support the current setup? 5 wards within correctly, we have 9 submitters that support the proposal, keep everything as it is. And on the other hand, we also have 9 submitters who reject the proposal and suggested changes to the ward boundary. So it's again a 9 against 9. And again, for full transparency, we submitted as an organization, but if all of our members would have submitted personally under their own name and opposing the proposal, it would be 9 against 25. In the report from your staff, we can read, quote, 2 submitters suggested changing the Motueka ward boundary, 2 submitters suggested disestablishing the Mutui-Waimea ward. Such a statement is misleading because it's wrong, because there are 9 submitters who oppose the proposal. 1 suggested to only have 3 wards, or the other 8 submitters, so the majority of opposing submission, identified that the issue is the Mutui-Waimea ward. Besides our organization, 7 other people came to the same conclusion, independent from us, that the main issue is the Mutui-Waimea ward. And I can name them. It was Mr. Thorpe who said, I don't support much of the proposed representation, and he suggested exactly what we did. Mr. Mathias said, I do not believe that Richmond alone required 4 councillors. That seems ridiculous, unless they cover from Richmond to Mort and out Bright waterways, so a change of boundaries. Mrs. Ellis said, I suggest disestablishing the Mutui-Waimea ward. Mr. Gray said, many Richmond residents live in what is being called Mutui-Waimea. Maybe the boundaries of Richmond need to be extended. Mr. Harper said, I do not support the proposed number of only 3 councillors for the Mutui-Waimea ward, given its population. Mr. Struthers said, unjust and non-compliant underrepresentation of Mutui-Waimea ward. And finally, Ms. Tate said, I suggest disestablishing the Mutui-Waimea ward. So the issue is clearly the Mutui-Waimea ward. We suggested to split the Mutui-Waimea ward so that the Mutui part is merged into Motueka and the Waimea part is merged into Richmond. Such an arrangement would not only set the numbers straight so that the majority actually get a fair representation within the 10% rule, but more importantly, such an arrangement would reflect what is called a community of interest. It's a community of interest. That is the underlying principle how we need to set the ward boundaries, communities of interest. And the Local Government Commission published a nice paper on their website, and they describe what a community of interest is. Who had actually read this paper of the 52 pages? The document is called a discussion paper which explores the concept of community of interest as it applies to local government boundaries. And after reading this paper, it became clear to me that the current Mutui-Waimea ward makes absolutely no sense. And to the people who say, oh, that's for historic reasons, or people are used to this for so many years, that's not relevant. Because the representation review is about the future. How do people get a fair representation in the future? Yeah, but in the past, no, it doesn't matter. The past doesn't matter. And you already do it in another area where you only look forward. When you do your climate change policies, you only look forward. And the argument that people are used to burning fossil fuels for more than 100 years would be considered nonsense. The same applies to the representation review. It's about looking forward. The past doesn't matter. What are the communities of interest that we currently have in our district? Richmond, yes. Motueka, yes. Lakes Murchison, okay. Golden Bay, for sure. Mutui-Waimea, no. That's not a community of interest. The people in Wakefield, where do they work? Where do they go to school, shopping, sports, recreational activities, swimming pool, library? I could go on and on and on in this list. Very unlikely that the majority of them, that they go to Upper Mutui, Mapua, or Motueka. And this applies equally to the people living in the Mutui part. I personally live in Upper Mutui. I go to the supermarket in Motueka, to the library in Motueka. My children do sports in Motueka. When I go out for lunch or dinner, it's in Motueka. Every month, I listen to the Motueka Community Board meeting. And very often, I go to the Motueka Sunday market. No disrespect, but I don't even know if there is a market in Wakefield, Richmond, Brightwater. Every week, I go 3 or 4 or 5 times to Motueka. How often do I go to Wakefield? Probably 4 or 5 times a year. That's not my community. I don't know a single person from Wakefield, but I do know a lot of people from the Motueka area. And I believe a lot of people feel the same. What we currently have with the Mutri Waimea Ward is not a community of interest. This council ignored for far too long this issue for whatever reason, I don't know. But now we need to act. We need to address the issue. We need to give people a fair representation after the next election. And this needs to be based on the principle of community of interest and the 10% rule. The guidelines from the Local Government Commission, they say, quote, each local authority needs to consider all submissions received and must be able to demonstrate that it has done this by providing reasons for their acceptance or rejection, quote end. I submit that the Mutri Waimea Ward needs to be disestablished because it's not aligned with democratic principles, and the people should get a fair representation after the next election. Thank you. Happy to take questions.
Thank you. Open for questions. We've got a couple of minutes, so any questions that anybody has? Just one from me. In terms of the previous representation review, if I recollect correctly, I think we suggested shifting some of the Mutri Waimea Ward into the Motueka Ward to help address the submissions we received and certainly the feedback we received at the meetings in the Mutri and Natamoti and the Motueka Valley and Tasman was very strongly against. And ultimately our final proposal, or the final proposal, reverted back to the Mutri Waimea Ward. So how do you kind of reconcile that view and opinion? And you're right, it may have changed in the intervening period of time. But that was very clearly the feedback that we received at the time. How do you reconcile that with your view that the Mutri Waimea doesn't have an identity? There is no kind of collective feel that it actually is a community.
I think it comes down that, at least that what I heard from a lot of people, that they don't really know what the representation view is. It's an obscure name, and they're missing education, right? There's a lot of there's a preconception that it's about rural versus urban. I think that's what ties in what you said, right? Town, that's a city, and we are in the Mutri, we are rural, but this is actually not what a representation is. The rural urban boundary is not relevant to this, because a lot of people go to town, go shopping, their children go to school. So that's not, it's one factor, but it's not the determinant factor. And I think most people, with all respect, lack education, and we need to educate the people in this regard.
Interesting view.
Because I didn't know this before, right? But I read the paper from the Local Government Commission, and makes clear that rural, that's not the primary factor. That's irrelevant. It's how, because there's a lot of interaction between people in town and living rural. So, and I think there's a misconception, at least that what I heard. Yeah, but there might be other reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is a bit of a case of the determinant of a community of interest is as much not necessarily a technical where you shop, or it's where you feel you most correctly, align with or feel. And clearly, from my experience representing the Mutri Waimea Ward for a while, there is actually quite a clear view that is where they see themselves being represented. And yes, there is a bit of a rural-urban thing in there. Absolutely, I think that is. And whether that's legally, technically correct, I guess that's why we have this process. And ultimately, it's a political decision, not a pure numbers game, in which case we wouldn't need this submission hearing. We'd just do the numbers and draw the boundaries.
But it's also about the numbers. It's about the 10% rule. You cannot completely ignore the numbers.
No, you can't ignore them, indeed. You have to consider them in coming to your decision. Correct. Yes. Councillor Greening.
So just following on from that conversation, in a way I was left apart, but I'd like maybe a fuller explanation. Can you just run us through your understanding of the community of interest rule or test? You've indicated that it's not a rural-urban difference, and so we shouldn't be turning our mind to that. Perhaps you could indicate to the hearing what we should be turning our mind to when we are considering the community of interest.
Yeah, just quickly, it's more what people do, right? People on a farm in Upper Muteri, yeah, they live there, but they don't stay there 24/7. They go to the library, they go shopping, their children go to school. The sports ground are in town, so it's about how you interact. So where do you travel from which area to which area? And I travel a lot from Upper Muteri to Motueka, so I feel strongly about Motueka. I want to know what's going on in town, and I never go to Wakefield or Brightwater. It just makes no sense that I'm together in this pool. Yeah, we are all rural. We share some rural identity, or however you might call it, but it's where do I go back and forth? It's not between Upper Muteri and Wakefield in the rural area. It's this crossover between what is the town and where do I live. So at least that's what I read out of this paper from the local government commission that I mentioned. Yeah, it's about library. It's about a service center for the Tasman District Council. Right there is no service center in the by Mayor Muteri Ward. There's a service center in Motueka, and I go to the service center in Motueka. There's no big supermarket in my ward. I go to Motueka. It's like these central places where I need to go when I have a life. That's what I read from this paper. Yeah.
Thank you. So one last question, Councillor Kinnemont.
It's probably not a question, it's an invitation to come along to a meeting tonight, 7 o'clock. The Muteri Hills Community Centre, the Muteri Hills Community Association is having their AGM. And you'd be more than welcome to come along to this meeting and meet other fellow members in your community.
Mike. Thanks, Mathias. Thanks for coming and taking the time, putting in a comprehensive submission and appearing today. Next up, we have Bruce Struthers. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you, Mayor King.
So same deal. I'll give you a ding if you're still talking, coming up to 10 minutes. Otherwise, time for questions.
Okay. I won't try to bore you with a shaggy dog story because I see that some of you have been already bored with shaggy dog stories. But let me explain why this concept of representation matters to me. I'm a Canadian, was born a Canadian, lived in the States for an awful long time, moved to Puerto Rico and saw a dramatic change. Namely, I saw an agricultural-based society with a few very strong families who basically owned the entire island, displaced as Filipino sugar became cheaper, and the industry that came in was tourism. Does this sound like a familiar scenario? Subsequently, when tourism had run its course and the lure of gambling in Puerto Rico instead of Havana was diluted by New Jersey and Las Vegas, tax policy allowed companies to move into Puerto Rico. First was oil refineries, then pharmaceuticals and computer companies, and they could not be taxed for all their operations in Puerto Rico. When that limited time offer disappeared, so did the industries that showed up, and the result is oil refineries that are rusting, lack of employment. Again, potentially a predictor for how things could happen on our West Coast. Then I moved to Seattle, which was a gorgeous area. Its industry was primarily fishing, logging, aviation. One of the largest employers, Weyerhaeuser, the timber company, stopped getting the prices it wanted from forestry products and changed its model on a dime to real estate and development. So what was big patches of forest all of a sudden became cookie cutter houses and traffic congestion. Again, a predictor for how things could go here if we don't pay attention to what's done there. I had problems with the way of life I had in Seattle disappearing as more people joined me. Thus, I'm here. Representation, where I hope I don't get to see it again. By the way, Toronto used to be a sleepy town, is now a megalopolis that goes from Syracuse through Oshawa and up to the lake country that used to be cottage or batch country. So it's a mess as well. Representation review. The US is supposed to be a democracy. In other words, one man, archaic view, one man and woman, one vote. It has something called the Electoral College. And that was put in place before we all were here, before Tasman was here, Nelson was here. And it was put in place because most of the men and women who could vote were illiterate and couldn't understand what the candidates were saying. So they needed someone to represent them in a college which actually did the voting. That worked well when everyone was illiterate, but in my lifetime, I saw the popular vote in 2 elections not follow what the Electoral College did, and thus George Bush and Donald Trump were elected. And George Bush showing up resulted in 9/11 restrictions on air travel, surveillance by their government agency on the internet, so that affects us. A lot of effects that have occurred. Who knows what Donald Trump has done? We'll find out. One thing it did was encourage my trip down here. So that's why I care about representation. I'm a geek. I love numbers. Probably most of the submitters are also geeks, and we're proud of it. That's why your population numbers really matter to me. And you, I believe, are using census numbers, projections of census numbers that are 5 years old, where if you waited just a few more weeks, just as you're waiting a few more weeks before making a decision on dog laws, you would have the complete, accurate Stats New Zealand census counts to derive your numbers from. And so I would encourage you to do that because the numbers do matter, especially in an area that is admittedly in substantial change. And to reinforce what my predecessor has said, in a changing community, you have to be looking forward in what representation will be like for the next election. So if you're going to shift the numbers a little bit, I'd ask you to shift in favor of what you think the future will be, what the demographics will be, and what the community of interest will be. Going back to the past, I'm looking at a June 6, 2006 Engineering Cities Services Committee report where a young and callow Councillor King indicated that adjacent landowners should be paid for work, and Mr. Drummond needs to define what the community of interest is. And I agree with that sentiment. And I'm not sure I read it in what we have to consider. What is the community of interest? Because, and going back to CN 1805-44, it was resolved that elected members are the eyes and ears of the community and often the first point of contact for wards, ratepayers, and residents. So your role is incredibly important. Underrepresentation, I think, doesn't serve anyone, especially those that every second Monday of the month trundle from Wakefield to Mapua late at night to listen to Mapua residents bang on about problems. There needs to be more of you. You need to be local. You don't make a lot of money. And I think we can afford more of you than we can afford more staff members to support you, because your staff's paid better than you are and don't live this job 7/24 as you do. So I would ask for overrepresentation. If I look, and I would ask you to read the paper, which is called The Concept of the Community of Interest. It's 52 pages long, a long slog. I've only found sound bites, but one good sound bite is the concept community of interest is a nebulous one, lacking precision and having different meanings for different people. So you need to have that precision. In the case of, how can I find it? One of the environmental documents, the Waimea Inlet Management Strategy and Action Plan, the community of interest is pretty much defined as all living beings in the area. So I don't know how you engage bacteria to get their opinion, but you need to precisely define that before you consider bending the rules a little bit to meet what is status quo from the previous representation. And it's critical this time because we do have an election in about a year. I'd like to see more of you on the ballot. I'd like to meet more of you. I'd like to hear your views as soon as possible. And don't be shy, come out and please express those views to us, because I think we'll all benefit from it. 1 minute. The topic of amalgamation. Again, Mayor Tim, I think you tripped over your own words. You said that in the past, concerns about amalgamation with Nelson, you have concerns, particularly in regard to rural representation. I would say that given where the councillors appear to live, the rural community is more than represented, and you're walking the streets of the rural communities. So I wouldn't worry too much about, sorry, using my own timer. I'm done.
I don't think Mr. Honolulu has arrived. So if there are some questions, by all means ask them. Well, I've got one. It's along a similar line, I guess, and the topic that both of the submitters have spoken about in relation to communities of interest. I note with interest your view of just effectively having one more councillor to Moutere Waimea and ending up with an overrepresentation, which in many ways, in your view, may be better than underrepresentation. So that's an interesting suggestion. In terms of the previous conversation and about the merging of the Waimea Moutere ward, which is another way of addressing the same topic to kind of even up the numbers. What, how do I ask this question? What's your view of so that could be done, and you could, and we had suggested that previously, put some of the Moutere Waimea ward into Motueka, put some of it into Richmond. In terms of the ability for those people, or the influence that they have over the number of people elected, so Richmond's number would go up by 1 probably if you added those people in, potentially, depending on how many. But the ability for the people who go into that, would then be a small part of a much larger ward. And yes, they would get to vote for the same 4 or 5 people, but their ability to influence the outcome of that would be dramatically reduced. Do you think that is a good outcome, even if it meets the numbers?
I think so, because again, the most important of your job, part of your job is representation. And the more of you who can hear directly from residents and ratepayers and then deliberate on what they're saying, the more effective you are on the job. And I think it's money well spent.
Thank you. Councillor Mackenzie.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Mayor. Morning, Bruce. I'm just wondering, I've been thinking about this and representation, and what I see actually across the ward that I represent is that representation actually plays out a lot in the local community organisations. So across the Moutere-Waimea ward, there's a whole number of them, of which obviously we meet at the Mapua one, but there's a lot of other ones as well. And so that link in to the community and how you get that understanding of the community and representation, that is a vehicle to achieve that. So I'm just wondering how you think those, you know, say in Moutere-Waimea, there's probably 6 or 7 of them. How do you think they play out in terms of community of interest?
For once, I have no ideas.
Okay, we can park that.
All right, thank you very much. Again, thank you very much. Comprehensive submission and some interesting views and ideas. And thank you for coming along, both speaking and being available to answer questions. So I appreciate it. Right. So at this point, we will break, just simply because we'll break for 10 minutes just to see if anyone can contact Mr. Halur and just double check if he is or isn't available, is or isn't attending to come along. And then we'll reconvene at 1:15, is it? I'm reading that correctly. And then we will move into, we'll get the report, representation review submission hearing deliberations report from John and Lee. Right, so break for 10. Barry and Stuart hopefully making their way back in the door. No, hopefully they're right there. Oh, there's one. Is Barry on his way, Stuart?
What's that?
Is Barry on his way?
Yeah.
So yeah, never let one leave. Yeah. Right, we will get back underway. So Graham Halur not joining us. So I'll come across to John and Leith to cover off this hearing and deliberations report.
Right, so you've obviously got the reports in front of you. I don't normally like doing these slide to members later on, but I just want to read a passage out because we want to just do some conversation around the rationale for retaining the Moutere-Waimea ward. So we're just going to read that out. That'll be reflected in the minutes, and we'll open to questions after that. It has been quite time consuming pulling this together, trying to get this right. So this refers to section 5.10.2. If I could just read this out. Options such as this for the Moutere-Waimea were discussed during the earlier stages of the review, but not progressed on the basis that disestablishing the ward would divide existing communities of interest. And we've heard a bit about that conversation this morning. The ward comprises a well-established network of settlements, which are well serviced by local facilities and amenities, and supports a strong local network of community associations. The ward's settlements are predominantly rural and coastal in nature, and do not naturally share common interests with the more urban centres of Richmond or Motueka. So we intend that to be added to the minutes, which would then form the final proposal. So I don't know if we've got much more to add. We've tried to reflect commentary around the submissions we received in that agenda. So we're open to any questions, unless Leith, you've got anything to add.
Through the chair, I'll just note that we have Stephen Hill from Election NZ online as well to answer any tricky questions.
Cool, thank you. Welcome, Stephen. So it's open for questions, comments, feedback, and or moving and seconding. Deputy Mayor Bryant.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thanks firstly to the staff for the work involved in this. Having been involved in a number of these now for some time, probably 4 representation reviews. There is a process we have to follow, and I do have a question, and it's perhaps for Stephen. What is the final date that we have to make a decision by to give the representation, local government commission time to review? I understand there is a date that we have to have completed this process by.
Yeah, thanks, councillors, Mr. Mayor. I'm just looking to see the detail. 28th of October is the date by which you will need to have publicly notified your final proposal. That's set out in the legislation as being 8 weeks after the closing date of submissions.
Right. And then anything received after that or any comment goes to the commission rather than us, as I understand it.
Yeah, that's correct. If there are objections or appeals, the council receives those, but essentially just collates them and forwards those on to the local government commission. And it's their process from that point on.
Right, thank you. So my view is that we've spent some considerable time on this. We've done pretty much as most in the community would like us to do, whether they be the silent majority or those that have submitted. There's been no groundswell of support for any major change. So I'm relatively happy and comfortable with what we're proposing for the next election, and are happy to move that in its entirety as it has included the inclusion of Maori wards.
Okay, so it's been moved. Is there a seconder before I got Councillor Greening to speak? Councillor McKenzie.
Am I speaking?
You can speak if you're seconding.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, look, I will second it. I mean, I think it is. It's not disappointing, the level of interest we've had in submissions, but you know, you have to form a view about what that indicates actually, and maybe the view that you can form is across the whole district, 92 people have put in a submission. Does that mean in actual fact that people are disengaged, or does that mean that by and large, because we're not proposing any significant shift other than the inclusion of a Maori ward, that people generally are happy with it? So, you know, it's very, it's hard to work out what you assume that means, but in my mind, I'm going to have to go to the point where I assume that people are happy with it. I mean, in the community of Wakefield, for example, I even tried to mobilise some effort to change the boundary around Totreview Road, which I'm sure you've all heard me talk about that before, where, you know, part of that kind of area is in the Lakes Murchison ward and part of it is in the Moutere Waimea ward. Well, actually, I didn't read one single person that actually even wanted to put in a comment around that. So I'm going to have to let that one go, even though personally I think we should change it. So, you know, you just have to form a view about what you assume by actually a low level of engagement in the process. So on that basis, I'm happy to second it.
Thank you. So it's been moved and seconded. Councillor Greening.
Just a question, really. I was hoping we would work through the issues more systematically rather than shotgun them as a motion. But my question to Stephen is there anything preventing us from doing as what was proposed by one of the submitters, in fact, a few of them, which is boundary adjustments that may result in the disestablishment of the current Moutere ward and basically separating them out into 2 larger wards, Motueka, Richmond, and perhaps Murchison.
So who wants to answer that in terms of the technicalities around, is it a possible decision?
The question was for Steve.
So-
The question was for Stephen.
Yeah,
through
so-
Chair.
Sure. Happy to answer that. Yes, the council does have the ability under legislation to make changes to its initial proposal. And as long as those changes are in response to submissions, so you can take matters that have been raised in submissions and make amendments to your initial proposal along those lines as you see fit, and they would then be incorporated into the final proposal.
Fantastic. And we've I'm not so sure if you were sitting in through the hearing or not, Stephen, but we had some discussion about communities of interest. I'm just interested to know whether existing associations somehow are a consideration in determining fair representation. So, for instance, we have some mapua associations, maybe boating associations, that would currently work with existing Mootri ward councillors, and I think that was expressed by Councillor Mackenzie and to some degree by Councillor Kinmore. But if the boundaries change, I assume that the linkages would just work with a different councillor. Or
for some reason, Mark, your
defined
connection this
boundary.
morning is
so
a little challenging. So just what you froze there for a while, and some of your comments have been a bit staccato.
So I'll say it again. I'm just wondering whether the linkages, the community linkages that were alluded to by Councillor Kinmoth and Councillor Mackenzie, for instance, the Mapua associations and other associations, influence the communities of interest in setting those boundaries, or whether actually those linkages are not a strong determinant of boundaries, because those associations will still be there. They'll just link up with a different representative because the boundaries have changed.
Stephen.
Yeah, so the legislation is doesn't effectively deal with community organisations. Those are outside the scope of this process, of course. But those kind of community networks and community associations should be part of your thinking when you are making the call as to what constitutes a community of interest. And I think if we go back to some of those principles that we've talked about in earlier workshops around, what a community of interest is, there is no single one definition. It's multiple factors, but a lot of it is around the sense of community identity and belonging that people have. And so those community associations would be part of how people think of and identify and relate to an area. So there are multiple factors to be taken into account. There's not any particular requirement that community associations, are specifically dealt with by you, but they should be part of your thinking. And there is, no clear call one way or another.
And just finally, my last question.
Yeah, Mark.
In relation to the point made, which is effectively silence is acquiescence, which I think not necessarily accepted in contract law, but if we, as alluded to by Mackenzie, have only received, say, 100 submissions on it, can we take it, or can we turn our mind to the fact that an overwhelming majority have not spoken, and therefore we assume that they are supportive of the resolution or against the resolution? How do we treat that?
Is that a question for Stephen, Mark?
Yes, it's part of the consideration.
Stephen.
Again, that's not something that the legislation gives any clear guidance on. That's a political decision that you have to make as elected members, drawing on your own experience of engaging with your communities. So, it's not something we could give you a direction on.
Okay, fantastic. So we, thank you, Stephen. Just to the chair, are we now debating it, or are we going around asking questions and then we debate it afterwards?
No, you're welcome to make a comment or your view. So we have a resolution moved and seconded. So it's a combination of you've asked a number of questions. If you wish to make a comment, if you wish to hold comments, I can come back to you before we finally put the resolutions. Over to you, Remy.
Okay, so it would have been useful to step through this, because I think, as pointed out in the submissions today, there are really essentially three issues, I think, that came through this representation, and certainly through the submissions that were made, which was the Maori ward, which got a lot of attention in submissions, and generally I felt that there was broad support for the Maori ward. There were some dissenting voices, but of the people who made submissions, I think I would say strong support. So I'd hope that we would have rallied around that together in support of that, rather than making it all one big bundle, because then you're forcing people to vote against what they support or vote for what they don't support. So that's unfortunate. I think it should really be separated. But I certainly support the Maori Warden, and so do the submissions. The other discussion point, as pointed out earlier today, was the community boards, of which there are two, Motueka and Golden Bay. I felt, certainly from the submissions today, that there was a feeling that we needed over-representation, and the example was provided that Golden Bay is overrepresented. Communities of interest, and for me it's about the interaction with areas, and I think the argument made today was a compelling one, and I think that it should be about fairness of representation, and really that's really about ensuring there is not under-representation. And so I don't think that our current boundaries are reflective or obtain and deliver fair representation on the population that will be there when this is put forward for voting. I think that boundary adjustments were generally supported from all the submissions. Unlike Councillor McKenzie, I probably don't consider silence to be acquiescence. I'm here to take the evidence presented to me, which is through the hearing and the people who chose to speak. I cannot assume one way or the other whether silence is acquiescence or just discontent with what is put before them, and they just can't be bothered. So I come back to earlier submission round where we had the greatest level of submissions, nearly 1,800 submissions on the Waimea Dam, overwhelmingly against it, and yet people were still arguing that was a still community.
I think we've got most of what you said,
anyway,
but it is quite,
to suggest,
you may wish to just flick your camera off and see if that improves your
yeah, sure,
the speaky part.
No, consume less data. So I do think the linkages are what we should be focusing on, and we should be focusing on fair representation. I think that the boundaries do need to be adjusted if we are to obtain fair representation. We have entertained, before we went out, boundary adjustments, but that was not supported by the majority. That would have delivered fair representation numbers. The submissions today, which really are the ones that we are now compelled to entertain, because we can't, I think, entertain the other minor ones because they weren't supported as we went out to consultation on. Again, support a fairer representation, and that's what this is really about, fair representation. I believe, I know the point was made that there are community linkages, Māpua associations and other associations. They will still be there, and they will still have a voice, and they will still have an elected representative regardless of where that boundary is. So I don't see that as determinative or in any way undermining fair representation. It's just it's a different point of contact. Those associations still remain, and we shouldn't be or treating them as determinative, which I think was suggested by Councillor McKenzie. So in my word, I would probably be against the resolution as it currently stands in terms of not supporting the boundary adjustments. I think they are required. If we did then entertain those boundary adjustments, I would then, after we've done those, step through the last one, which is the the community boards. And depending on where those boundary adjustments lie, I think the discussion then opens itself up as to whether we still need some of those boards or not, because the question is, do we have fair representation? And many of these boards are an historical element of previous council mergers and also of history. And we've developed, as we've already pointed out, people now can connect remotely. So those boundaries are disappearing in terms of some of the need for some of these community boards. If we are maintaining the Golden Bay numbers, then and the Motueka numbers, and maintaining existing boundaries, then you do wonder whether we're very well overrepresented in some of these areas. And I think there is an opportunity missed with the current resolution to actually drill further into those and get a better representation for fair representation as opposed to over-representation. Clearly, if we're going to entertain more councillors, then yes, we can entertain what was referred to by one of the submitters as over-representation, which he certainly welcomed. But we're not doing that. We've confined ourselves to a number of councillors, and therefore we have to divide those up into what would be fair representation. So I actually support what was presented today, which is a boundary adjustment between Motueka and Moutere, and therefore also Moutere and Richmond. That would still provide the same level of councillors, would more equally provide fair representation within those wards. The Golden Bay issue, I think, for me, the community have certainly supported 2 councillors. My personal view is I think that it could have been reduced by 1 councillor if you're keeping a community board there, because you have a number of people who can share the workload and between the community board and a council representative, and would be the people in that community who are not as isolated as they used to be, although the feeling from the community is that they still require that level of representation. I personally felt that GB Golden Bay should have been part of Motueka, and you would have increased the number of representatives for both areas. Adjustment that would have made the representation more fair. So I suppose I'm indicating
in summation, I think you were about to say.
Pardon?
In summation, you were just about to wrap up, I think.
Suggesting that I'll be opposing the resolution as it currently stands because of the boundary adjustments not being made.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that comprehensive commentary. I'll now come to Councillor Kinnemont.
Thank you. Through the chairs, question for Stephen Hill. Being a new first-term councillor here, I'm unaware of the process previously and what happens on other local councils. So do other local councils struggle with the plus or minus 10% rule, or is this just fairly unique with Tasman District Council?
Stephen.
It's not uncommon at all. I think it's a natural tension that's built into the legislation, in that the intent is to try and achieve fair representation through the plus or minus 10% rule, but balancing that against the communities of interest factors, which the Act also has in place. And that's why the legislation allows for councils to put up a proposal that does not necessarily meet the plus or minus 10% requirement, but to seek an exemption from that on grounds which are generally related to communities of interest factors. So yeah, there's a balance between both of those elements.
Thank you. Any further comments before Councillor Murray?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I find this an interesting process in terms of where we get voted in our popular vote in terms of award, because once we're here, our boundaries aren't boundaries. So I'm sure there's a number of Motueka residents that contact my colleagues in the Waimea Moutere, and I know there's a number of Moutere, Waimea, Wakefield people that contact Motueka ward councillors. And so I guess for me, it's how do we get diversity around the table, and ratepayers will choose whatever councillor they think will listen or try and help them with their issue. So it's a really interesting concept. And saying that, I did read Tasman Democracy's submission, and it made a lot of sense to me. But in terms of, does it change the outcome? Not really. The outcome is based on who ratepayers put around this table and how contactable and how engaged they are once they get to this table. It doesn't really have a order. And so in terms of getting the best demographic spread, I'm happy to support the recommendations in this paper. Because for me, it's about diversity, spread, and a much of a greater range of people than trying to get them condensed, because the bigger the ward, the less opportunity for diversity potentially. So I'll be supporting.
Thank you, Councillor Murray. Is there anything further before I put the? Oh, you're already had to go. So, Councillor Hill.
Thank you, Mayor Tim. I'd agree with Councillor Maru, and I was going to say something similar, but probably don't need to add. You articulated that really well. I think the idea about, what assumptions we can make is interesting, isn't it? I think if we'd gone out with our proposal being for one Golden Bay councillor or no community board, or you would have got a fair swack of submissions come flying in, I suspect, probably for both sides of that argument. But and I think if there'd been some significant changes to boundaries, or it sounds like even some minor adjustments, although Councillor McKenzie didn't seem to be able to get any traction. But I think submissions would come in, and that's what that's one assumption I'm making about this. I mean, it's a low number of submissions and responses. I think if people were really unhappy with what was happening, we would hear from people. I know at home we certainly would. And I just, take the point from Councillor Maru that once we're here, we take the oath to represent all of the Tasman district. It's a funny little business, and you can, doodle around divvying up the numbers and over-unders. But in reality, that doesn't make any determination at all about how much work any of us do, what we do, how we do it, who we represent. If we're here, if we turn up, we can, we all know that you can not turn up, still get paid. Most people out in the community don't know that. So it's a funny little equation in a way. And of course, you've got to base it on something. So I have no reason not to support the resolution today. And let's just keep representing all of the residents of Tasman as best we're all able.
Councillor Walker. It's all right, Councillor McKenzie. I will come back to you.
Thank you, and through you, the Mayor. It's quite interesting because Motueka Community Board did a drop-in outside the museum on Friday, of which I was the councillor that made myself available. Interesting how many people asked, what the heck is a representation review? And is it too late to submit? Because for a lot of them, they were focused on the bylaw reviews, which sadly, the timing of all of this put a lot of pressure to certain people who are engaged in our community. So that was an interesting dialogue that we had at that drop-in. For me, I sit here going, each time that Tasman District Council does the review of our representation, we have to go and get the Commission to sign off on our plus and minuses so that we can kind of justify the margins that we sit in to get fair representation. We've just added another ward to the mix. So the pluses and minuses have even more of an effect, per se. No, it's a statement. And I guess my concern is, again, where have we taken the community on if we were going to change our boundaries? Did we front that conversation? That's the question.
That's probably a question you can answer yourself for your community.
Yeah, it is. So no, I won't be supporting the resolution today on several matters. One is with the Māori ward, because I've already made my stance on that. And the second one is about the fact that we are not looking at where the boundaries sit, even though some of our community have made it quite clear what they would like to see. So supporting that part of my community, it's a no from me.
Can I just ask the question for Councillor Walker? So can whether it's Stephen or Leith, how does the Māori ward affect the plus or minus 10% for the other ward calculation?
Yeah, I can comment on that, Mr. Mayor. The Māori ward calculation is calculated separately to general wards, so it does not affect the plus or minus 10% calculation for general wards. If there were to be more than one Māori ward, then there would be a plus or minus 10% evaluation across those wards, but it does not apply between Māori wards and general wards.
So I think that's a critical point, because Councillor Walker, I think, assumed in her statement that it did, because hence her reason for opposing, one of the reasons. So just for clarity, the existence of a Māori ward does not impact, just so we're all clear. Councillor McKenzie.
Thank you very much, through you, Mr. Mayor. Just another point. I mean, I guess we all have different things that we take into our minds and the way that we think about this. And there is something else going on as well, I think, that I've certainly taken into my mind, which is there's actually a huge amount of change hitting local government. And ultimately, over time, actually, I can see a situation where even the functions that are delivered by the council or the services that we deliver, there is going to be change, whether it be in planning committees, whether it be in building consent authorities, whether it be in delivery of our three waters. Actually, everything is changing around us as we speak. So actually, what we're representing from the community across which functions is going to change. And I'm certainly aware that actually when you do a simple thing like change a boundary in a large organisation, there's a lot more to it than that, because you have to realign all your back office systems. And actually, it can be quite a big thing for an organisation. And I'm not keen in this current point in time to actually waste resources in doing that for what has not been a compelling case from our community to affect the change. So, you know, that is another thing that is in my mind about why I think I'll be supporting the resolution. Thank you.
Thank you. If there's nothing further, I think it's been an interesting conversation. There's some very good submissions, and it's actually quite easy to agree with the technicalities of some of them. If you go on the numbers, then absolutely a lot of that makes sense. It's also actually quite easy to agree, if you have a long association with Mutri Waimea, with Mr. Struthers suggesting we just add another councillor. I actually quite like that idea, and end up in an overrepresented situation rather than an underrepresented situation. I think the challenge is, though, communities of interest and fairness are not definable things. They're not numbers. And if this was all about the numbers and the technicalities, we wouldn't be part of it. The legislation would simply say, you work out the numbers, you divide the lines up accordingly, and you can't be inside or outside plus or minus 10%. They wouldn't give us a choice if that was the intention. But clearly we do have a choice, and it is a political decision, and it does reflect what our views and assumptions are. For some of us, will be attending community associations and understanding and getting feedback to a greater or lesser degree, depending on their interest. For others, it will simply be intuitive. For others, it will be about the numbers and the technicalities and the legislation. There hasn't been a massive amount of feedback, and I tend to agree with those who have said if we had a real dramatic change, like anything you suggest changing, you will get a lot more feedback. Now, whether that's beneficial, adds to the conversation necessarily, or leads you to a different outcome, that kind of remains to be seen. The community of interest thing, I personally don't believe it's anything to do with where you shop or where you go to the library or where you go to a local swimming pool. That are factors of necessity. There is no supermarket in Upper Moutere, there is no community swimming pool, and there is no library. So by definition, you must go somewhere else. Now, some of those people will go to Motueka, as one of the submitters said. Some will go to Richmond. I actually know people who go to Wakefield from Dovedale because it's just over the hill. So lots of people will make different choices, and some of them may go to a supermarket in Motueka and a swimming pool in Richmond, or vice versa in the future when there is a swimming pool in Motueka. However, I do think it's much more about where you choose to live. The choice you have made to live, to buy a property, your single biggest investment in your life, and reside, to me, indicates more about the community of interest that you have than where you shop or where you go to the library or where your kids go and play sport. And I also think the creation of community associations is another indicator. I think Stephen said it's not a determining factor. It's not something that is part of the review, but it does indicate there is a community there. Hence, people have created a community association. Most of them use community in the title. And that is an interest that they have and share in common with the other members of that association. So, look, I think there is no compelling case to change, certainly not dramatically. And as Councillor McKenzie pointed out, even the relatively minor boundary adjustments that have either been suggested in previous processes or have tried to be encouraged by councillors through this one haven't really gained any traction. So on that basis, I support the resolution as it's been moved. So I'll come across to the mover for his right of reply, and then I'll put the resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So just a few things I'll respond to and make some final wrap-up comments. So certainly in relation to Maori wards, as it says, firstly, as it says in the report at 5.12, Council's decision to retain a Maori ward. The decision to establish a Maori ward is out of scope for the final proposal and therefore does not need to be considered further. So that puts that matter to bed. Now, the matter of the community board and the over-representation in Golden Bay, in 2018, when we went through this process last time, the Commission went to some lengths to say that Golden Bay needed a second councillor because of the issues of an isolated community and all the challenges around that. So it's very unlikely they're going to change their view from 2018. And also in 2018, we proposed changes to the Waimea Moutere ward, as people are now advocating for, which were only really tweaking around the boundaries, and the Local Government Commission didn't agree with them and stayed with the status quo, which I personally believe they would do again if we were to put anything up, unless it was really significant for the Moutere Waimea ward. And unlikely they would support an extra councillor on the numbers, because they tend to, and I've read a number of their decisions over the years, they tend to stick with lesser rather than more councillors because of the efficiencies involved with that. So I think it's a long bow to think that we will get any major change around the Waimea Moutere ward through that process, or this process, and then, because most likely every time since 2001, when the legislation was enacted, the decision has been made by the Local Government Commission in the end, and I believe it will be this time. The only good news is that I found last night when I was doing a bit of research for this, they now live stream the hearings for that, so you'll be able to watch how they make their decision. And they started with Haranui. That is good news. So with that, I'm ask you all to support the current resolutions and support the proposal.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Bryant. I will now put the resolution. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Against?
Against.
No, no, and no. And do all three of you wish to have your votes against recorded?
I think it already has been.
Okay. Thank you. So that draws us to the conclusion of the open part of the agenda. No. Oh, amendment to standing orders. All right. So there's amendment to standing orders item on page 72. Someone move or second. You well, you can ask a question. Elaine is here to answer questions.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Mayor. Look, I think this is reasonably straightforward. I think that we've all learned to live with technology, notwithstanding the fact that we have glitches every now and then, and we need to continue the practice that we've established. So I'm happy to move the resolution.
Thank you. Move, Councillor McKenzie.
I'm happy to second, but do have a question. So this is just in relation to quorums, I understand. The paper that's covering subsequently, will that look at the options around voting and stuff like that as well?
So you're quite right. This is purely to cover the quorum for attending by audio visual or audio attendance. The revised LGNZ model standing orders will be presented to the council as they're available, which is the full standing orders.
So then they'll be able to give that consideration.
Yes, you will.
Okay, thank you. So it's been moved and seconded. Yeah, I've got Councillor Greening. Councillor Greening.
Oh, that's right. No, that's right. I've just read it. I've just seen the word not. That's right. Fantastic.
Excellent. Yes, a very important word in the context of this resolution. Okay, it's been moved and seconded. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against. Carried. Thank you. Now I look for a mover to go into committee. Move Deputy Mayor Bryan, seconded Councillor Hill. All those in favour, please say aye. Against. Carried.